our text today, we want to read from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, about the resurrection. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices which they had prepared. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise." And they remembered his words. And returning from the tomb, they told all of this to the 11 and to all the rest. That was Mary Magdalene and Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, as they did not believe them. That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. And while they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What is this conversation which you're holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened in these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since this happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us as they were at the tomb early in the morning, and they did not find his body. And they came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were there with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. And he said to them, "O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe all that is in the prophets has spoken. Was it not necessary that Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted them all the scriptures, the same concerning himself. This is the word of the Lord for God's people. Thanks be to God. It's an unusual time, isn't it? And day for us. This reminds me of college and seminary when I had to preach to a video camera and not to an audience. But I want to speak to you. I'm hoping and praying, as you are, that we'll soon be back in church. To say that I missed the gathering of the church, and I know that you feel the same way, is an understatement. The gathering of the church, especially on Easter Sunday, is a difficult thing to stay away because this defines who we really are. We are the people of the resurrection. While I know that, I also know that it's best that we follow the guidelines and that we stay away from each other, at least for the time being. We only have to look at the paper at Canterbury Nursing Home to see that awful tragedy, to know that we are doing the right thing. After all, most of us in this church are in that high-risk category. I'm not saying we're old, I'm just saying we are longtime residents of this place. So it is important that we follow the guidelines. But maybe, just maybe, this new twist on having to follow some social distancing will give us a new insight into maybe that very first Easter morning. I remember one of my seminary professors saying that Paul only had one sermon, and honest with most preachers is we only have 1 to 3, and then we just keep reworking them. But Paul's sermon was simple. Jesus Christ was crucified, buried, and rose again. And no matter what we talk about in a sermon, we always come back to those same ideas. There are some who like to talk about what's wrong with the world. I'd rather think about what's right with it. But if you watch the American Idol, Simon Cowell, who's not one of my favorite people, but he always in his evaluations normally will begin, the problem is. And when he begins that, he normally criticizes someone for not doing whatever. But to quote Simon, the problem with the church is we still struggle with the issue of the resurrection and how it impacts our lives. What does the resurrection mean to us? Some of the disciples at first didn't believe the news that Jesus had risen from the dead. They had heard the women, and even the 2 men who are on the road to Emmaus, they had heard the story from the Marys and the others who had gone that said, Jesus is alive. The rest of the disciples who had stayed in Jerusalem, a couple of them, according to John, went to the tomb. Peter runs in, but where do they go? They go back to the upper room. They lock the door. They hide. They're not sure, one, that the resurrection is true, and two, they're not sure about what that really means. The empty tomb, or the words of the women, was not enough to convince them that something had happened. As I thought about today and what I might say, I went back to the very first Easter that I was with you as your pastor. That was many years ago, and it was the second service that I had with you. And I remember using one of my favorite quotes for Easter. It comes from Richard Bach, who was a famous novelist at the time, or many years ago. And one of his novels was simply One. That was the name of it, One. I never understood the title. I don't even remember what the plot was, but I do remember one of the characters in that story saying this: bad things are not the worst thing that can happen to us. Nothing is the worst thing that can happen. Now we can all identify with that. I suspect that we've all had some experience, and probably we're experiencing it right now with the coronavirus. We are isolated at home, and while the world's going on, it seems as if nothing is happening because we can't interact, we can't do things, we can't be what we used to be. Waiting is sort of like watching paint dry or grass to grow. We know that it's happening, but it is ever so slow, and we want something to happen. Have you ever waited in a hospital waiting room for the doctors to come, and the minutes turned into hours, and the hours turned into days, and you're waiting and waiting? You know something is happening, but you're just waiting. Or maybe, and especially now with this coronavirus and so many people out of jobs, and people are going to be waiting to hear, am I going to be reemployed, or can I find a new job? Young people are graduating and are anxiously awaiting whether or not they're going to be accepted in a school or in the military or whatever it is they want to do. And the waiting seems as if nothing is happening. Now, if you can take that experience and magnify it about 50 times, maybe you can begin to grasp what was happening on that very first Easter morning. The sun had set on Friday. Jesus was dead. He had been put in the tomb. And all of these friends were absolutely terrified and afraid. When the women went to the tomb that morning, they were not going looking for a risen Lord. They were looking for a dead body to anoint. That was the custom. But Jesus had died so late in the day that they didn't have time. And according to Jewish traditions, you could not anoint a body after sundown on Friday. But as they are there looking for that body to put the spices on, the angel says, "Why are you seeking the living among the dead?" And then the angels asked, "Do you remember what Jesus said?" I'm not sure I would want to have that test question asked to me. Do you remember what was going on or what was said? But the angel reminded them, he said, "I'm going to die and be raised up." Now they had all heard these words, but as Simon might say, the problem was they had heard them, but wasn't sure that they would apply to their problem. Isn't that our problem today? We've heard the familiar story all of our lives. Easter is the same story. We hear the resurrection story. We sing all kinds of wonderful hymns to celebrate that. Then the problem is we have to walk by faith. With that message transforming and changing our lives. I don't think the question is, do we believe this because we affirm it? It's easy to affirm. The question is, how does it help us in our lives? And especially in this time of the coronavirus. How is it that this message of hope resonates in our lives so that we can live victoriously even in our isolation? I think maybe the key has to do with something we call faith. Faith is doing something that you probably don't think is going to work. Faith is doing something that you may have tried many times and failed, but you have been asked to do it again. I know that we are in a time now when some are even asking, can our church survive? But I want to suggest to you that we will never go beyond what our faith is. We will never exceed the faith that we have. I think the message of Easter is that if we have faith, that God can use us and that we have a future and hope. It doesn't do any good to have special events or to do great advertising or to have whatever, unless we have the faith to believe that God is still in the business of doing something wonderful even when it seems that nothing is happening. Now you have to think about that for just a moment. We are in a time when it seems nothing is happening. And isn't that the thing of what happened a long time ago? We will never go beyond our faith. But Easter is the proclamation that something happened. Jesus Christ, who died on Friday, arose from the grave. That's the only message we have. That's the whole story of the church. And we do other things, and we have to do other things, and we talk about other things because they are important to life. But ultimately, it comes back to this one very issue. We are people of the resurrection. We are people who affirm that one sermon that Paul had. Jesus Christ died, arose again, and because of that, we can live forever and ever and ever. Now we know that, but sometimes we don't always live it. One of the guys that wrote a lot about how to do church and that sort of thing was Leif Anderson. He wrote several books about how to get the church reorganized and that sort of thing. And I remember one of his stories, and it was an interesting story, and especially for us Baptists, but he told about a beer company. Now, I do not like beer. I never did like it. I think that it is awful. But this particular company had some of the worst tasting beer that you could possibly have. They couldn't sell the beer, so they hired the very best PR company that they had, and their sales went up for about 3 months, and then they went down. They did some research, at least said, and they discovered that the problem was not in the message, but in the product. So what did they do? They hired a PR company and found a new PR company to repeat the same problem. Lee's point was, this is what we do sometimes in church. We need to go back to our product. Our product is, we have the message of the resurrection. Jesus Christ who lived, who died, and rose again. Go back to that first Easter. These people who were convinced that bad things happened on Friday had destroyed all the possibilities of anything good ever happening again in their lives. If ever there was a crowd that needed some faith and needed some boosting up and needed someone to help them, it was this crowd. But even after they have the encounter with Jesus, it takes them some time. Remember, it will not happen until 40 days later at Pentecost. And it may well be that we don't come back together as a church until Pentecost. And that would be something very significant and historical if we come back on Pentecost, because that was the birthday of the church. We want things to be sure. We want to know that there's a guarantee. But the fact is, there are none. It simply comes down to our faith. It takes a lot of faith to face the uncertainty of whatever it is, whether it's the coronavirus or other events in life. I don't know if you remember, but it was Easter Sunday in 2007 that I preached my final sermon as your pastor before I came back as your interim. That was a special day to go out on Easter because it was the affirmation, but it was also a scary day because I didn't know what retirement was going to be like. We all look forward to it, and I'm glad I did, and I have no regrets. But it's always an uncertain time because what does the future hold? But when our faith comes to us in the story of the resurrection, we have something worth proclaiming. I've always thought that the saddest line in stories that I ever read was in the play The Death of a Salesman. In that story, Buck, the son, stands at his father's grave and laments, "My father never knew who he was." Folks, there's no magic formulas for life. Bad things are going to happen. And the only way to get to resurrection is through death and a cross. But there is a message that something has happened. And that it is the resurrection. And that changes everything. It changes the message that death is not the end, but the door through which we pass into eternal life. When we follow that idea through Paul, who later exclaimed, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Look at what happened in the story again briefly. The women go back and tell the disciples who are hiding, "Jesus is alive, he is arisen." The disciples didn't believe the women. After all, these are women, aren't they? So we can't believe what they say. It's interesting that the very first evangelists, though, were women. And even when the disciples didn't believe them, what did they do? They kept telling the story. They kept telling it again and again. And then when the disciples finally embraced the story, they encountered the very gospel that the women did with them. They tell the story, and at first, nobody believes them. What did they have to do? They had to keep telling the story and telling the story, but they also had to demonstrate by their lifestyle that Jesus Christ was alive and meant something to them. The words of that hymn, "I know he lives because he lives within my heart," is the greatest affirmation that we can ever make. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus, when they finally realized it was Jesus who had traveled with them, they immediately return and go 7 miles back to Jerusalem. Now, for you and I to go 7 miles, that's pretty easy because we crank the car and go. But imagine that you have walked 7 miles that day. They got more than their 10,000 steps on their Fitbits. But they rushed back to Jerusalem because the message was so important. They had met Jesus, and he was alive. And they had to share it with their friends. That's the only message that we have. And when it becomes real, it becomes exciting, it becomes empowering, it becomes transforming in what it does. Often at the end of the service, I will say something like this: be sure and say a good word about Bethlehem and Jesus Christ this week. There's nothing else to say or do except to live as if that has real meaning in our lives. We all go through the times of disappointments. We will all face times when it seems as if nothing is happening. But then comes the news. Jesus Christ who died, who was buried, arose from the grave, and he lives forever and ever and ever. And he's invited us to live with him. Join us, we pray. Father, we thank you for the message of Easter, of the resurrection, of what it means and how it transforms lives. May it be real with all of us to this day and forever. In the name of him who gave so much and gives so much today in eternal life. In his name we pray. Amen.